It's beautiful. The exhibit looks fantastic in here. It really does. This is the 6th venue where the exhibit has been hung. It was in storage during COVID-19. So I'm so thrilled to see it up again, and it will just continue to go and to teach and to relay through the brushstrokes of a child what life is like on the road as a migrant. So first, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming today in person over Zoom. I'm grateful to you for showing up, for expressing by your presence the priority. We're committing to engaging, to contemplating the perspective of someone on the other side of the wall. I'm thrilled to see this exhibit hanging again, showing and telling folks about what migration is through the eyes of a child. Painting the border, a child's voice brings attention to the ongoing challenges that migrants, especially young travelers, face as they search for safety in their journey for a good life. A child asks, scanning the oxidized 30-foot-high steel barrier in front of her, who is on the other side of this wall? Her mother answers, we are. Identifying the other is a matter of perception and orientation. Who is there, who is here, and which of us is the other? The US-Mexico border presents us with a conundrum. Does the border cross the land, or does the land cross the border? Concretely, the border wall marks an international divide that stretches just shy of 2,000 miles between California and Texas, crossing 4 US and 6 Mexican states. The barrier has evolved over the past 150 years from being a hint of a discerning line in the dirt to one of the most militarized borders in the world. And fortification of the zone continues. In 2022, $7.5 billion. $7.5 billion were awarded in contracts by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and US Customs and Border Protection to reinforce this divide. That is an increase of $1.3 billion over last year. Think about that number. There are almost 700 miles of fencing that disconnect the US from Mexico or the other way around. And some of that fencing costs $46 million a mile to erect. The wall is a substantial piece of work. I took a photograph of this wall a few weeks ago in rural Arizona in the Sonora Desert. The image that I took from a distance reveals to the viewer an impenetrable barrier, an uncompromising divide. The message, what is the message that gives us? An alert student recently looking at the image that I took told me photographs are reliable envoys of truths. More, she said, than narrative, more than paintings or drawings or other forms of visual or plastic arts, because they don't lie. So the harbinger of truths about the border and the border wall, what is it? A child's canvas that reveals a tender perspective formed by feelings and lived experiences, a photograph taken from afar of the wall, other official narrative expressed in policies and laws. As you contemplate the paintings in this room, I would invite you to consider what informs your understanding of the US-Mexico border and that loaded expression, the US-Mexico border. What does that encompass? What does your knowledge of that encompass? What informs that? Where do the truths lie? So the picture of the wall that stands 30 feet tall is made of concrete and steel bollards. It's also accompanied by narrative that the big, beautiful wall will protect us from them. That only shows us one perspective of the wall. The image shows a towering, uncompromising barrier. But if you move a little bit closer, you will see gaping, deliberate breaches that provide a toothless division between the two countries. Far into the desert, migrants cross unrestricted. At this place in the desert, the Sonora itself is deterrence enough. It's called territorial denial, and it is an intentional method of funneling migrants to the deadliest path that leads into the US. The further out into the desert that you get, the less of the barrier you will see. The sections are there and they stand disconnected, mighty and tall, causing tremendous ecological damage and human suffering and death. 8,000 migrant deaths have been recorded since wall expansion began under President Clinton, continued under Bush, continued under Obama, and of course, the famous Trump reconstruction and expansion of the wall. Last year, the number of border crossers based on Border Patrol encounters hit record highs, and so did desert deaths. 750 human remains were found in the desert in fiscal year 2022. There is no number offered for migrants whose remains are not found. The true number of migrant deaths is unknown. A curious fact relayed to me by Dr. Gregory Hess, Arizona's Pima County's chief medical examiner, is that the true number of live migrants caught by Border Patrol agents is also unknown. Dr. Hess pointed out that one of the people whose remains ended up in his morgue had been returned to Mexico by Border Patrol agents at least 4 times on the record. Under Title 42, expelled migrants may, cross numerous times and they may be expelled numerous times. This means that one person crossing illegally into the United States may account for numerous apprehensions. 10 apprehensions does not equal 10 people. Tragically, the migrant to which Dr. Hess referred died of exposure on his 5th attempt. Title 42, a public health policy that the Trump administration initiated as a way to expel migrants, streamlines their exit without criminalization, without any due process or asylum petitions. President Biden continues to use this policy. This policy will become moot once the COVID-19 emergency officially ends in May. The physical wall isn't the only wall that divides people at the border. Various presentations of the wall exist. These other representations include legislation, policies such as the Trump administration's migrant protection protocols. You may recall this. This is an unfortunate label that does not reflect the bearing that the policy has on migrants, the asylum process, or the Mexican cities that felt the brunt of the responsibility of keeping tens of thousands of migrants housed and fed and safe when the MPP was in place. Definitely not protected by this legislation. Definitely a misnomer. The MPPs were the impetus behind the stories created in this exhibit, Painting the Border, A Child's Voice. Maybe you can see in the brush strokes the impact of the policy on some of the young artists who produced the paintings. The Trump administration presented the protocols in early 2019, and it was launched in Ciudad Juarez, where the paintings were produced a little bit later that year in March. Essentially, what this meant was that migrants who would normally process through our asylum procedure were turned away by the thousands, tens of thousands. By August, when I got there, the city had 19,000 MPP recipients who needed shelter and sustenance to survive. The city can accommodate 769 migrants in its shelters. Eventually, 30,000 migrants would wait in Juarez to apply for asylum. Virtually all of them homeless. In all, across 7 different northern Mexican cities, some 70,000 people were stranded by the MPPs, waiting for their US court hearings. The MPP fairly decimated the US asylum system, shutting down the process of application. The good news is that the MPP stopped enrolling asylum seekers in August of last year. But on August 21st in 2019, the MPPs were in full swing, and thousands of children were among those that were marooned and vulnerable. In Juarez, the state government, church groups, NGOs opened shelters and provided tents for folks who couldn't get into the shelters. Living on the streets in Ciudad Juarez was and is still very dangerous. Migrants are prey in Juarez and everywhere else in northern Mexico border cities to a powerful and unchecked criminal element. Juarez is a city of about 1.5 million people with a recent history of such violence that its own residents refer to the most volatile stretch of drug cartel work as a war. This is a city where pink wooden crosses with the words "Ni una más," not one more, are ubiquitous, a reminder that hundreds of young women, the youngest 8 years old, have been disappeared, murdered since the mid-1990s, and no one has been held accountable for any of these murders that make up hundreds of women killed in this serial killing. Juarez is a city where a poet and activist coined the phrase "Ni una más," and for her dedication to her poetry and her human rights activism, she was murdered. Her name was Susana Sanchez. Juarez is a city where drug cartel members fighting and continue to fight to control La Plaza. They have killed thousands of innocent people, including 16 young futbolistas, soccer players, junior high school age, who were celebrating a soccer game win. Cartel members, after the massacre, said they got the address wrong when they gunned down and killed everyone at the fiesta. This is a city where journalists' remains have been found next to typewriters near the International Bridge. This is a city where the famous open letter was published from the editor and was published all over the world. And it began in El Diario, and it was a letter to cartel members asking, "¿Qué quieren de nosotros? What do you want from us? What do you want us to publish?" Juarez is a dangerous city. It's a traumatized landscape. One of the children who painted his story in the exhibit here, and you may be able to find it, wrote that he does not like the border because it's too dangerous for him to leave the shelter. Migrants are victims of ransomed kidnappings, sex trafficking, extortion, muggings. The number of crimes committed against MPP migrants was climbing in August of 2019 when I was there. 500 kidnappings, 90 sexual assaults were recorded by the organization Human Rights First that summer. This number included, at the time, MPP enrollees in all 7 cities where they were held, but that just scratches the surface. In the summer of 2019 in Juarez, things were bad. My friend Luca told me, really bad. Luca de Alba is a tireless volunteer who lives in Juarez. She's a shelter director, a school organizer, a children's author, and an engineer. And at the time, she was a representative for the World Organization for Peace. Luca was pivotal in organizing this exhibit and all of the work that went into it on the ground in Juarez. That summer, when it seemed as though the city could not tolerate any more violence, any more Trump hate speech, any more Border Patrol insults yelled at migrants asking about their asylum cases, things got worse. On August 3, 2019, news of a mass shooting at an El Paso Walmart reached the migrants. 23 people were gunned down and killed, 30 others injured by a 21-year-old man from Allen, Texas, who drove 10 hours to kill back-to-school shoppers at Cielo Vista Mall in El Paso. A manifesto released shortly before the massacre mimicked Trump administration rhetoric and stated, quote, "If we get rid of enough people, then our way of life will be more sustainable," unquote. The killer knew that Cielo Vista Mall is where Mexican shoppers from Juarez go regularly, and especially in August, to stock up on school supplies. My friend Luca's cousin was shot. His wife and daughter were shot. All 3 survived, but her cousin spent almost a year in the hospital. He will never fully recover. Luca told me that it was not unusual that her cousin would go with his family over the Santa Fe Bridge from Ciudad Juarez into El Paso. These are sister cities and they are close. About 50,000 people a day cross the bridge between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso to go to school, to work, to attend the University of El Paso at Texas. Residents of Ciudad Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, have in-state tuition at this Texas college. People from both cities live bi-nationally. If you have a visa, you can cross. These crossings became really restricted under Trump. They've become more relaxed now, not quite back to normal, but they're getting there. Some of the Juarez migrant children were aware of the deadly attack that took place at the Cielo Vista Mall. One person in particular painted her interpretation of this. You can find it, it's quite strong. You can tell right in the back next to the heart. We, myself and Luke and other volunteers, went to Juarez in an attempt to offer a bit of relief to the youngest recipients of the migrant protected protocols. With donated money from Sylvia Walker, a Boise, Idaho resident who wanted to do something to contribute to alleviating the pain of the policy wall, we decided to provide respite and a bit of a recess to the children who were stuck in limbo in Juarez. We planned a fun day at this dreamy interactive space in Juarez called La Rodadora, the Tumbleweed. It's a museum in the heart of Juarez. We wanted to provide a break from the shelters, to create a space for MPP children to remember what it was like to be a child, to be carefree, if only for a few hours, one memory that they could take with them on this journey. We wanted them to take at least one memory of this horror story that they were experiencing that was good, that left them feeling special, beloved, respected. With a bit of explaining and sometimes begging, shelter directors allowed for their charges and their parents to join us at the Rodadora. In all, 60 children were bused from shelters around the city to the Rodadora, where they ran around, they played, they painted, they made necklaces and pizza and drank Fanta, and they painted these pictures. Renowned and prolific El Paso muralist Simi Alvarado accompanied us there. Simi is a muralist from El Paso. If you go on a walking tour there, you will see his artwork outside, all over the walls there. On the Rodadora day, Simi walked with us from his studio, a stone's throw from the El Paso, from the Santa Fe Bridge in El Paso, that leads to Juarez, to Mexico. We all carried backpacks. There were 6 of us going to Mexico that morning. Our backpacks were full of paints and canvases and beads and necklaces and t-shirts and caps, anything we thought kids might like. At the Rodadora, Simi gently guided the young painters and explained how to tell a story with a paintbrush. He asked the youngsters to answer one question. ¿Qué opinan de la frontera? ¿Qué entiende de la frontera? What do you think about the border? What do you feel about the border? That was it. That was it. That's all I asked them. That's the only prompt. The youngsters were given 2 canvases, and we asked if we could take one of them. I promised to take their paintings across the border to share their stories. They were mesmerized by the prospect that their stories would cross the divide, but that they could not. They can see the border wall from the buses that brought them to the Rodadora from their shelters. They can see the Rio Grande and the bridges from their shelters. They can also see the wall protruding from the earth and reaching high and dark, fortified by steel and mesh and armed guards. Their view, their perspective is marked by this physical embodiment of denial. The US-Mexico border has been called an open wound, una herida abierta, by Gloria Anzaldúa. And the literal wall that cuts the terrain there is an abrupt and powerful physical representation of the fears and intolerances shared by those who built it and those who enforce it. But there are other walls in place that create what I call the frontera effect. The frontera effect represents the permeating influence of the physical construct of the border wall, as well as the symbolic embodiment and power that the wall projects upon communities throughout and beyond the United States. The wall becomes a delocalized symbol of dominance of one country over another, of one people over others, as the impact of laws governing passage through it influence us personally and questions our moral convictions. We see these permeating influences, negative and overbearing and racist rejection of people fleeing prosecution, abject poverty, death squads. We see the permeating influences of border narrative that is insulting and negative, derogatory, demeaning. We see this pervasive influence and rejection in our policies that hit the ground with real human consequences. We see it in the Pima County coroner's list of remains found in the desert, and then a desperation of the mothers and fathers and children who are still trying to find each other, that had been separated at the border and through deportation. If we pay attention, we can see it in the faces of the children whose generous spirit embodies hope and trust, and who have shared their most personal journeys with us through their paintings. We see hope and courage and dedication and outpouring of aid, support by volunteers who travel to the border and accompany migrants through the Annunciation House, Kino Border Initiative, soup kitchens, in tents in the desert with No Mas Muertes. We see a positivity and a determination in the solidarity of the Samaritans in Green River and Tucson, folks who scan desert paths in groups to aid migrants in trouble deep in the desert, individuals trek into the desert to leave water, they fill tanks over and over again, even after the tanks are slashed by anti-immigrant vigilantes. We see hope and respect and love in the crosses that are planted by artists Alvaro and Ciso in the desert, where victims' remains have been found. So while there is reason to despair, to tear our hair and shake our fists at the injustices still prevalent at the border, there are strong and positive grounds to nurture the hope and love and solidarity that is and has been a positive force, an army really working in the trenches, not only at the southern border, but across the country as well. Thousands of volunteers on both sides of the border are dedicated to mitigating the damage of the physical wall, the policy wall, the money wall, the virtual wall, and all the damage that it's caused. So in spite of Title 42, the savage history of separating parents from their children and the shameless political theater of lying to and transporting migrants far from the help that they earnestly need, I could go on, but I don't want to because I want to talk about hope. There is hope. The Biden administration has, according to the Migration Policy Institute, locked at least 300 executive actions on immigration. Biden has increased refugee settlement ceilings to 125,000. Under Trump, it was shamefully 18,000. Under Biden, the Department of Homeland Security has restricted ICE arrests, and officers are instructed not to arrest or detain pregnant, postpartum, or nursing individuals, and cannot take enforcement actions against non-citizens if they are victims of crime. Alejandro Mayorkas ensures that deported non-citizens who served us in the U.S. Armed Forces can return to the United States if they were unjustly removed. Notoriously brutal detention centers in Georgia, Massachusetts have been closed. Travel bans have been lifted. Asylum cases are slowly being processed. There's still a backlog of 11 million citizen and immigration service cases on the books right now. The circumstances are still dire and there's still work to be done, protests to be held, letters to be written, hearts to be turned. In the meantime, there is hope. At the border, I work with a lot of nuns, a lot of empowered sisters are there, a lot of volunteers are there. I was at a shelter a couple of years ago in El Paso. We would accompany the migrants after they had been let out of detention. We would make sure they had a place to sleep, a meal, medical care. We connect them with their family members. And if we were lucky, the bus would come, driven by Border Patrol, when the shelter's volunteer doctor and nurse were there, because inevitably anybody who's been in detention will come out of detention ill or injured. This doctor and nurse at the shelter came twice a week in the evenings to serve people voluntarily. Sometimes when someone got off the bus, they needed to be taken to the hospital and treated for injuries encountered during their journey, but mostly their injuries were encountered while they were being detained. Medication such as insulin is frequently withheld, wounds untreated, or caused by abuse in detention. Late one night, I took a mother and daughter to the hospital as soon as they got off the bus. They were from Guatemala. The daughter had been bitten by a spider on her way on her journey. By the time she got to us, her whole leg was swollen. She was pretty sick. She had a fever. Neither women had slept for days. They'd been in detention. They were cold, they were thirsty, they were hungry. Detention rooms where migrants are kept are freezing. The nickname is the hielera, the refrigerator or the ice box. Everybody calls them that. The ice boxes. I took the mother and daughter to the ER, and you all have been, if you've been to the ER, you wait for hours. They were exhausted. They hadn't slept for, I don't know, a month since they've been traveling. Finally, I approached the admitting nurse. It's El Paso. Everyone knows what goes on in detention, and most people speak Spanish. And I spoke to her in Spanish, and I said, look, migrants, they just got out of detention. Can you help us? She took us to a back room, the storage room. There were these beds, and we sat down, and she went and brought these warm blankets. Now, when you actors have concrete surgery, they bring these warm blankets, and they're just heavenly. And she brought the blankets, and the daughter went to sleep immediately. But mom began to talk and to cry. She said that she would cry lágrimas amargas, bitter tears, at the memory of her time in detention, but it wasn't the cold room, it wasn't the frozen food, it wasn't the chlorinated water that were making her cry bitter tears. It was the memory that every morning at 4 o'clock, a Border Patrol agent would come in and wake everybody up and strip search them. That is why she cried bitter tears, but not for herself. Her memory was focused on a young mother who had a baby. Now, when you're in detention, all of your outer clothing, you can keep your t-shirt or a blouse, but you can't keep a sweater, you can't keep a coat, everything is taken. Well, this young mother had a baby and she had a blouse, an extra blouse, and she would hide it in the trash can when she'd hear at 4 in the morning, the Border Patrol agent coming in to strip search them. And my mother told me that she would squeeze her breast so hard, and she picked up her shirt and her chest was full of bruises, that she would be in pain. But that's not why she cried lágrimas amargas. She cried because the mother, every time she would hear the footsteps coming down the hall, would take the blouse off the baby, put it in a trash can, and then she would have to put the baby on the floor so she could be strip searched. And that is why the mother cried amargas, amargas lágrimas. We made it through the night. A kind doctor came in and did an ultrasound. He wheeled the ultrasound in. I'm not gonna make you move again. He tried to speak Spanish to her. He was working on learning Spanish. He treated her with dignity. He gave her some antibiotics. He went back to the shelter. The doctor was still there waiting for us. And when we got there, he thanked me. He thanked me for taking him to the emergency room. Can you imagine? It was like 2 in the morning by then. He was still there. This doctor who would work all day and then come to treat the migrants. So there is goodness at the border that permeates through the country. The border is a conundrum. It's a paradox. It's a place of division. It's a place of encounter. It's a place of hate and place of love. It's a place where migrants are still being kept from asking for asylum. They're still being expelled in large numbers under Title 42, which thankfully will become moot in May. All of the children who painted these life experiences that you see here have either come across into the US or they've returned to their home countries. Other children are in Juarez now, and in Nogales, in Nuevo Laredo, in Tijuana, and other northern border cities waiting to come across. The artwork you see here at the Visual Arts Gallery at SUNY Adirondack Community College tells the stories of 32 of the thousands and thousands of children journeying, some with a parent, some alone. In their paintings, they share their homes, their journeys, their hopes, and finally, their sense of reality on the US-Mexico border, their understanding of their side, the other side of the wall. So, thank you. I'm thankful that you gave me an opportunity to share these paintings and these stories. I was on the border about 3 weeks ago. It's a completely different story when you're there and you look and you compare the narrative, the official narrative, and then the narrative. I would invite you to spend some time looking at the paintings and reading what the children had to say, and I'll answer any questions if anything. If not, please enjoy the paintings.
So I'm part of the visiting writer symposium class where we come in and listen to visitors and how to create creative pieces, creative writing pieces based on what they're presenting and the stories that they have to tell. And one of our assignments is to do a creative writing piece on the experiences of kids here and the art presented and all that, and our interpretation of it. What are some ways that you think, like I've never been to the South, so I've never seen this with my own eyes. I've never been there to see it, probably with the same experiences you have, or especially the kids have. How do you think that as writers and creators have come about this, we can come at it from like a place of appreciation rather than appropriation, and with respect to the culture that these stories come from?
Oh, lovely question. So how would you write about this creatively if you have never been to the border? I think that it's fantastic that you're able to write this without being at the border, really looking through the eyes of the children and at their pieces of work. So if you look at the way that it's curated, very specifically, right? It starts with home. So the younger children wrote pictures or painted pictures of what their home is like. I mean, that's how I would go about it. Really believe what they're painting. And then the second group is the journey. Others wrote about their journey. I mean, this one is, right, is you can see 3 migrants with backpacks and a flag that doesn't have any colors on it because she said the land belongs to everybody, right? So, I mean, I would say that you're lucky that you get to look at this through the eyes, truly through the eyes of the child without having anything skewed at. I would do that. I would look at the way that it's developed and what happens in reality. For example, the picture of the young girl who knew about the massacre looking across at the migrants, and there's a migrant in the river who died, which had happened just a few days before I got there. Father and his 3-year-old drowned going across. And so, I mean, look, oh, it's wide open. I think that's how. I don't think that's really beneficial.
So I have family members who are in favor of the Trump administration, and I often try to tell them about the situation. All of the horrific things that are happening.
Well, I think one of the things that I was shocked by when I was driving along the desert wall is that it's not a barrier. We've spent billions of dollars on it, but it is not a barrier, right? I think that's one thing. I mean, because what that does is it reveals different truths about what had been presented to us, right? I think the narrative alone, if you look at narrative, even the press is guilty of saying surge, invasion, right? It's not a surge. These are individuals, right? There's no surge going on. And when you build a wall, you immediately build a wall against an enemy. Who's the enemy? These children. Are there large numbers? Yes. Are they the numbers that the Border Patrol is giving us? No, because those apprehensions are quadrupled at least, right? Because, so I mean, maybe just by presenting, first of all, the fact that that barrier is not actually a barrier. So all that money was spent to present a narrative. Maybe start there. I don't know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. If anybody else has any ideas about that, I'd love to hear it. Well, enjoy the paintings. Thank you very much for turning out. I really appreciate it. And good luck with your writing. I'd love to read it. Thanks, Lou.